If you have your Bibles, if you would turn to John, we're going to look at a passage in chapter 15 that we have looked at earlier in this series, but I would just like to read it again for you as we kind of set the tone of where we're going. So John chapter 15, verse 9 says, "As the Father has loved me, I have also loved you. Remain in my love. If you keep my commands, you will remain in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commands and remain in his love. I have told you these things so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete. This is my command. Love one another as I have loved you. No one has greater love than this, to lay down his life for his friends. If you are my friends, if you do what I have commanded you. I do not call you servants anymore, because a servant does not know what his master is doing. I've called you friends, because I've made known to you everything I have heard from my Father. You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you to go and produce fruit, that your fruit should remain, and that whatever you ask in the Father in my name, he will give you. This is what I command you. Love one another." This is our last week on this series, and we're going to be starting back into the Old Testament next week. But earlier in the series, I had admitted to you that as a second grader, I had a desire to learn to break dance. That did not go too well, and I never became an accomplished break dancer. But I think I was probably like most of us as children, where we are trying to find our thing. And so we try all of these different things. It's a pretty normal part of childhood. For me, was it sports, and I tried soccer for a while. I tried basketball for a while. Those didn't work out. I tried trumpet for a while. That didn't work out. I had a point in my childhood where I decided I wanted to race BMX bikes because that's what I loved. My dad had no desire for me to do that. And so he found out that the world championship was coming to Nashville. And so he took me. Sounds like a great plan. It was a trick though, because he thought, I thought, wow, my dad's supporting me. This is a great idea. And we go to the world BMX championships, and there were so many wrecks and so many broken bones that he convinced me I would never want to do that. So it was a bit of a trick that he played on me, and it worked. And then I went into skateboarding, did that, and was probably, out of all of these things, probably the thing that has been a part of my life the most. But even as a child, my parents weren't very supportive of that. They kept telling me it was going to just be a fad, and I would get over it, which I never really, to this day, that fad has not really ended in my life. I'm just 46. So that has kind of ended. So there's all kinds of things that we want to be, that we want to identify ourselves with. Back a few years ago, we were at the Kingdom Kids Consignment Sale down at the Methodist Church. I think it's called Hope Methodist Church now. But we were down there at the Kingdom Kids Consignment Sale, and I found something there. Anyway, I think it was under $30, and I thought, you just never know when a church is going to need this. So I bought it, and so I have it over here. It stays back there in the closet, but I bought a guitar. Okay, so I don't know if y'all know this, but I am a guitarist. Nobody? John is the only one that laughed. All right, so I want to invite Luke. Luke, would you come up? So here's my claim. All right, y'all ready for this? My claim is that I'm a guitarist. All right, because, so I'm gonna have Luke help me with this. Luke, are you I feel like the word, I know I'm holding this incorrectly as part of my problem. I feel like the word guitarist is weird. Is that a weird word? But that's the right word. Guitar player, guitar. Do you consider yourself a guitarist? Sure. That's not do you consider yourself a guitarist? Yeah. Okay. Lean into it. It's okay. All right. So, do you consider me a guitarist? No? Okay. I'm going to prove him wrong. Y'all ready? This is a guitar. This is the body of the guitar. These are called knobby thingies, right? That's where you plug it in. This is the neck and the fret. These are strings. John, did you tune it or yeah, it's even tuned. I didn't tune it though, but that might be a problem. These are like the little turny things to tune it. Okay, are you convinced yet? No, you're not convinced? But I own a guitar. Does that not make me a guitarist? Okay, so but you're a guitarist. So what makes you a guitarist? Do you own a guitar? Is it as pretty as this one? Did you pay more than $30 for it? You got ripped off.
Actually, no.
So, no. Did your parents pay more than $30 for it? Okay, they did. All right. So what makes you, Luke Krager, you act like you're afraid of me. You can come a little closer. I told him I was going to do this, so he's had some days to think about it. He thinks I'm going to hit him with a guitar. So, but all right. Would you feel better if you were holding this? Sure. Okay. You want to hold it? So, what makes you a guitarist and me not a guitarist? You can play chords. Okay. So I know what chords are. There's like different finger things. Like, is this a chord? Maybe. No. Okay. What else makes you a guitarist and me not one?
Chords and stuff.
He knows the names of chords and stuff. That's a very good teenage answer. And stuff.
And stuff.
Have you been hanging around Jake too long? Maybe. Yeah. That's a Jake answer. And stuff. So you know chords and stuff. What's the other stuff?
Play songs.
You can play songs. You can put the chords in the right order. Yeah, to play a song. You can read chord chart. How did this just come upon you one day?
I watched some videos.
You watched some YouTube videos. Okay, have you ever taken a lesson? Okay, I should have asked. This is like the lawyer. I should know the answers before I ask them. That wasn't the answer that I wanted. Your dad taught you. Okay, so you've taken lessons from dad, kind of. Do you listen to dad when he teaches you these things? Is your dad a better guitar player than you are?
That's debatable.
It's debatable. Wow, now it's getting interesting. This is when it gets good. Okay, so the last time I picked up that guitar was probably 3 years ago. When's the last time you picked up a guitar? Yesterday? Okay, what did you do with it? Did you name the parts like I just did? You played it?
Yeah.
Oh. How many times this week do you think you picked up a guitar? How many times would you have liked to pick up a guitar?
Probably at least like 3 times.
Okay, so 3 or 4 times, that's a good amount. All right, so do you still think you're a guitarist and I'm not? Yeah, you feel pretty good about that statement? Okay, all right, awesome, thank you. So thank you, Luke. Y'all give him a... Okay, so one of the things that we know from life, and there was a book about this and a concept brought up by Malcolm Gladwell that talks about the 10,000 hour rule. Now there's some people that debate this, but part of what Malcolm Gladwell, his whole idea is that in order for us to be great at anything, it takes 10,000 hours of practice to be great at something. 10,000 hours. Now, Luke, I'll tell you this, picking it up once or twice a week is not going to get you to 10,000 hours very quickly. So if we want to be great at something, it takes us a long time. If you just kind of do the math, 10 hours a week. If you practice something 10 hours a week, that's 520 hours, that's easy math, 520 hours a year, that comes out to 19 and a quarter years of practicing something 10 hours a week, every single week, to get to the 10,000, to be what Malcolm Gladwell would tell us is great at something. The thing, though, that we learn about this theory is that practice does not make perfect, but practice does make us better. We get better at things, but the thing is we have to be involved in something. What makes me the reason I'm not a guitarist, even though I own a guitar that I paid a whopping $30 for, just because I own a guitar, just because I can actually name some of the parts on the guitar, or at least know what those parts do, that doesn't make me a guitarist. But living a life where you say, this is something that's important to me and something I'm going to practice and something I'm going to get better at and something I'm going to push myself at, that's what changes our identity. That's what makes us who we are. And so part of what we learn is that practice doesn't make perfect, but rather practice makes us better. But we also learn that anything that we want to be great at or even good at takes a whole lot of work. It takes time. It takes us giving energy to something. It takes commitment. If we're going to be great, and if you are a young person and you want to be great at something, You have to give it time. You have to give it commitment. You have to give it quality practice. I really don't like the term practice makes perfect, because I think there's a lot of variables that go on, because you also have to have quality practice. You have to give it time. You have to give it commitment. You have to work for something. I want to look at a passage today. We've looked at the John passage, but I want us to turn to Matthew. I want to look at a few different little quick stories in Matthew chapter 7. This is at the end of the Sermon on the Mount. It wasn't until I was an adult that I heard kind of some of these opinions. My Sunday school teachers never told me this, and professors at Mount Vernon or at Trevecca or at Nazarene Theological Seminary or other pastors never told me this. But there are people that look at the Sermon on the Mount and see it differently than the way that I see it, and I think the way the classical kind of Nazarene view of the Sermon on the Mount. One of those people, probably one of the most famous people with this, is Martin Luther. Now, if you know who Martin Luther is, one of his great statements is the understanding of what's called sola scriptura. If you look up what that means in today's world, that means that the Bible is the sole infallible source of authority for the Christian faith. But Martin Luther, who coined that phrase, even made the statement when looking at the Sermon on the Mount, said that the Sermon on the Mount is an impossible ideal, that it is to remind us of how incapable we are to obey what God commands us, and reminds us of our need for grace. So Martin Luther, who would tell us that Scripture is the final authority in our lives, will also tell us, well, but the Sermon on the Mount, we really can't live that out. That when he looked at some of those passages, and the famous passages, if you just kind of flip through that you've heard it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I tell you, love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of the Father in heaven. Things like you have heard it was said of our ancestors, do not murder, and whoever murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you, everyone who is angry with his brother or sister is subject to judgment. Whoever insults his brother or sister will be subject to the court. Whoever says you fool will be subject to hellfire. We know these passages, and there are theologians out there that tell us we can't really live these things out. We aren't capable as people to live what Jesus is talking about out. Now, I don't know if y'all know this, but your pastor disagrees with that statement. I hesitate to do this, but I'll tell you my opinion on those statements. It comes from the comedian Kevin James. Some of y'all know who Kevin James is, and I will quote Kevin James. He was the guy on King of Queens, the big guy. I'll give you his quote on what I think of this. I don't agree. That's from Kevin James. You can quote him on it. I do regularly. But there are theologians who think we can't live up to this. This is an impossible ideal. And it's almost as if you look at the Sermon on the Mount, it's almost as if Jesus knew that people were going to say this. He knew that people were going to struggle with what he had just preached. And so he wraps up his sermon and he gives us 3 illustrations as we wrap up in chapter 7, 3 different illustrations. So the first illustration is in verses 13 and 14. It says, enter through the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the road is broad that leads to destruction, and there are many who go through it. How narrow is the gate and difficult the road that leads to life, and few find it. Now, sometimes we read this passage that the narrow gate is just kind of living this perfect life, but I think it's even bigger than that. It's living a life by taking Jesus and what he said seriously. That Jesus is the authority in our lives. He is the authority on what we believe and who we are. That's what it is to be people who live striving to go through the narrow gate. When we hear him, when we obey him, as we just read in John chapter 15, Jesus tells us, do you want people to know that you're my disciple? Well, love one another. And he reiterates at the very end in verse 17 and says to us, let me tell you again, one more time, what are you supposed to do? Love one another. We take these things seriously. So this is the first example he gives us. The next example is in verse 15, the very next verse. He says, be on guard against false prophets, who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravaging wolves. You'll recognize them by what? Their fruit. Are grapes gathered from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? In the same way, every good tree produces good fruit, but a bad tree produces bad fruit. A good tree can't produce bad fruit, neither can a bad tree produce good fruit. Every tree that doesn't produce good fruit is cut and thrown into the fire so that you'll recognize them by their fruit. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven. But who are the people producing good fruit? Who are the people that enter the kingdom of heaven? Jesus tells us. But only the one who does the will of my Father in heaven. On that day, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, didn't we prophesy in your name, drive out demons in your name, and do many miracles in your name? Then I will announce to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you lawbreakers. So we have our second statement. And then our third statement, which is probably one of our favorites because most of us grew up with a song about the third story. But it's another story that is reiterating what Jesus is telling us. And what Jesus, if you don't know where I'm going, he is telling us, pay attention to what I say, live out what I say. I'm telling you what life should look like for you. So he ends with a final story. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them. Notice what just happened. If you've heard these words, what are we supposed to do? Act on them. If you hear them and you act on them, you are like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain fell and the river rose and the winds blew and pounded that house. Yet it didn't collapse because the foundation was on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and doesn't act on them will be like the foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain fell and the rivers rose, the winds blew and pounded at the house, and it collapsed with a great crash. So let's just kind of summarize these three statements. I want you to see them. So he tells us, what is it? We finished the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus has made all of these claims, and he says to the people listening, I don't want you to miss the point of what I'm saying. These words are words of life. These words are the words that shape who you are. These words are the words of the will of my Father. So you want to know what life is like? It's about living into what I say. And he reminds us, verse 14, how narrow is the gate and difficult the road that leads to life, and few find it. We're going to talk about it in just a moment. This life is not easy. Jesus never promises that our lives as Christians are easy. Verse 21, the one who does the will of my Father in heaven, talking about the fruit. In verse 24, everyone who hears these words of mine, notice what he says. We have to hear, but what do we also have to do? We have to act. It's one thing to hear, but it's another thing to put these words into practice. I would argue, if Jesus didn't believe that we could put these words into practice, I don't think he would have told us to. But he's very clear. Hear them, put them into practice. Does that mean you're not going to fail? That's not what he's saying. But put these words into practice, and it will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock, who built his house on something that actually matters, something that will actually last. These are the words of Christ. Yes, they're an ideal, but they're also our lives. They also remind us that just a chapter before this, Jesus reminds his disciples to pray, your will be done on earth, right here, just as it is in heaven. That God's will can exist on earth. These are words that are transformational as people of God. So that brings us to our very last axiom as we have walked through these. And our last axiom is God transforms us through embodied participation. God transforms us. God transforms you through embodied participation. I do not become a guitarist because I own a guitar. If you want to consider yourself a guitar player or a guitarist, do you know what you have to do? You have to embody that. And embodying that is about participation. It's about practice. It's about hard work. It's about calluses on your fingers. It's about learning. It's about love. It's about all of those things that go into learning an instrument. And the Christian faith is a faith that says to us, God invites us into a life, and we are transformed when we are invited into God's life. So let's go through just a few kind of points that we see as we kind of understand this. And some of this you'll kind of see as we walk through. One of those things that I think we miss most of the time when we talk about this is last week we were in Acts. We talked about Acts chapter 1, the Holy Spirit's promise. We talked about Pentecost. We went through all of that. But there's a little word that in the church we miss all the time when we talk about this passage. If you remember, Luke's gospel ends. We move straight into Acts, and into Acts, Jesus, the author, Luke reminds us of kind of what's happened in Acts, or what's happened in Luke. He comes back, and the disciples are together. Jesus tells them, I'm about to ascend to the Father, but I have something you want that I need you to do. You remember what Jesus tells them to do? Okay, it's because we don't remember it. It's a very important statement. Let's look at it. Chapter 1, verse 4. While he was with them, this is Jesus, commanded them not to leave Jerusalem. But to do what? I highlighted it in case you miss it. To do what? To wait. What if the very first command of the church given to us by Christ is just to stop, to wait? Why did Jesus have them wait? Well, it's because the Holy Spirit was doing something. And I think so often part of what we do in our Christian life is we think we have to get out in front of God to show God what he needs to do next. And Jesus says, guys, this is what I need you to do. I just need you to wait. Wait. And wait for what? The Father's promise. Wait for what God has promised to do. So I think the first part of us embodying this participation, embodying and being transformed by what God is doing, it starts with rest. It stops with us waiting. The next piece is that we understand we start off with rest. So the first command given to the church was to rest. The second thing that I want you to see is that putting the teaching of Jesus into practice is more like learning an instrument than studying for a multiple choice test. Learning to live as Christ has taught us to live is more like learning an instrument than studying for a multiple choice test. Heather would tell you, I'm not telling you anything that she'd be upset for me telling you, Heather can memorize facts like nobody. She can memorize them, she can go take a test, and 2 years later you can say, hey, what did you say on this? You could give her the exact same test and she wouldn't know any of it. She can ace the test, but she can't remember, it just doesn't go down. It just sticks in her head long enough for her to take the test. That's not what the Christian faith is. The Christian faith is embodying a life. It's changing an identity. It's being a part of what we are called to be as the people of God. It's more like practicing an instrument and learning an instrument than studying for a multiple test. It's hands-on. There's successes, there's failures. You get frustrated. The next one is that love is a capacity we mature into. Love is rooted in action and relationship. That love calls us into action, that love calls us into a relationship, that love calls us to be involved with the people around us. Love calls us to show that love in relationship to how we live with other people, how we live this out. We can read about love all day, but we don't really learn what it is to love until we embody that love, until we live it out in the way that we are living. The last one is being a disciple is understanding that failure is part of the journey. We're all going to fail. We're all going to have those moments where we don't do things exactly the way that we wanted to do them. We're all going to have those moments where we look back at the Sermon on the Mount and we say to ourselves, I did not handle that the way I should have. That's part of living into that faith. Let me kind of wrap up this with one other illustration. I brought with me today, these seem really big when they're not on my feet. Size 14. I think, Orion, something funny? I think he's laughing at my shoes. I have small feet, thank you. You were tickled by how little my feet are. Is that the problem? These are brand new Ultra, which is the brand I run in, trail running shoes. They have exactly 0 miles on them. If you want to be a trail runner, you can go to Ultra's website and you can order shoes too. And you can put them on your feet and you can say, I'm a trail runner. These have 0 miles in them. But what we also know is that I brought with me another pair of shoes. These I had to carry in a bag. These are Ultra Mont Blancs. Same shoe, different color. 0 miles. And if you're a trail runner, you're a super nerd. So you know exactly how many miles your shoes have. So 468 miles. 0, 468. This one's like rattling because there's dirt in it. I can hear it falling. So we have a tread here, no tread here. These shoes are pretty much toast. They might have a few more little runs in them. But I bring these out. Let me get down to one each. I bring these out because I want you to see something. This shoe for me represents failures. It represents some falls. It represents mud. It represents some cold, some hot. It represents the time that I went with the kids up to Rainbow Falls in Gatlinburg. It was one of the first times I wore these shoes on spring break a couple years ago. It represents a lot. It represents rest because you have to rest your body. It represents all of these things to me, but it also tells me that I have an identity. An identity as a runner, an identity as a trail runner. This shoe, it's just a shoe. It doesn't mean anything to me. I can look at it and I can tell you that it hasn't been used at all because when they made this shoe, they put terrible shoelaces in it. And if you're gonna wear them, you gotta change the shoelaces. So it's never even had my foot in it because the first thing I would do is change the shoelaces in it. It's pretty much worthless when it comes to what it means to be a trail runner. This shoe has pain, has heartache, has victories. And what I'm telling you this is the only way that a shoe gets like this, you know what you have to do first? You have to put it on. You have to walk out the door. There's a joke with runners of every run starts the exact same way, by tying your shoes. You don't tie your shoes, you can't be a runner. And as people of faith, sometimes I think that we forget that walking this life starts the same way. Walking with Christ starts the same way that we have to tie our shoes. We have to get up and to say, I want to change the way that I'm walking. I want to change what I'm doing. I want to change the way that this life is going. I start by tying my shoes. I start by following you. And hear me. We know that failure is a part of it. We also know there's some incredible beauty that's a part of it. This week I was at my cousin's wife's funeral and once again reminded of just what beauty in life looks like. A lot of times when we go to funerals, we're reminded of what was great about life, what was great about a person. But all the things that I heard that day, all the stories that people told about Janet when we went to their house afterwards for lunch and everybody's telling stories and laughing and just being together, starts with someone that says, I'm going to follow. Being a Christian starts with us following, but it continues with us continuing to follow, to embody what it means to be a Christian, to show love to a world, to show hope to a world, to show life to a world, to show truth to a world. And today, as we close, that's really, as we've kind of gone through this whole series together, this is kind of the week that it all comes down to. Are we going to live our lives clean, beautiful, but unused? Or are we going to live our lives maybe a little bit dirty, a little bit gross, but to know that we've lived a life that has followed, life that has striven, that has followed and knows that God is the one that is leading? And as we wrap all this up, my hope and my dream is that we as the people of God will learn what it is to be followers. And today as we close, my hope and my prayer is that for maybe some of us, we just need to say, you know what, I need to start with step one. Step one is getting off the sofa, tying my shoes, getting out the door. To say, this is what it means to be a follower. This is what it means to build my life on something that matters. Now, most of you know kind of the way that we close, and if you want to pray with somebody, Pastor James will be right over here. If it's a moment in your life where you say, you know what, I've never made that commitment to even follow, James would love to talk to you about that. But I know for a lot of us, we kind of forget what it's like to get up and walk, to get up and follow, to get up and to go, knowing that God transforms us, not when we just proclaim that we're a Christian, but when we embody, when we participate, when we strive after God and what he's doing. And maybe for some of us, we just need to find that place to just say, God, I want to embody. I want to build my life. I want to act. I want to do what you've called me to do. And for us just to come and find that place this morning to pray. Say, God, here it is. May I follow you. Wherever it is you're leading, Lord, I want to go after you. Today as we sing, if you'd like to just find a place to pray, these altars are always open. If you would like for me to pray with you to anoint for healing, spiritual, emotional, physical, whatever that is, I'll be right down here. But today, may we put on the shoes, follow after God and what he's doing. Let us stand as we sing.